So welcome, everyone. Appreciate your time today. Very excited to introduce some of the key concepts in the book. And wanted to just talk a little bit about my background and how I came to this work. I'm a former principal consultant with Capgemini, worked mostly in business analysis, and have worked in digital strategy and product design and analysis in the last 5 or 10 years or so, with both large organizations and small organizations. Very passionate about encouraging more productive ethical discussion around big data. One of the things I came to realize in the last few years is big data represents one of the most powerful computing technologies in the history of mankind, and the opportunities it presents to improve individual lives and our society at large are unprecedented. I have a formal academic background in philosophy, and so it was sort of natural that my two interests as a professional in technology and my academic background in philosophy were combined. There's sort of an interesting anecdotal story about this. In my daily consulting work, I facilitate a lot of working sessions and workshops with people. And in a lot of those meetings, there are technologists of various different kinds. There are data architects, infrastructure, data center experts. And there's often a lot of business folks in the room. They're product managers and partner leads and platform and software as a service designers. And a lot of times a technologist, for example, a data architect, will realize that there's something particularly interesting that can be done with a new bit of correlating data. So we have the capability to provide this new service or this new capability or feature to our customers. And of course, the product people are like, hey, that's really great. They get very excited about it, and that's interesting and has potential economic benefits, until somebody in the back of the room says something like, yeah, but that's kind of creepy, isn't it? And at that point, let me make sure I'm getting on the right slide here. There we go. So somebody in the back of the room says, yeah, but that's kind of creepy. Are you sure that we should be able to do that, or that it's okay to do that? And somebody says, well, yeah, no, it's fine. And the first person says, no, it's really not. I don't think it is. That feels kind of creepy. And it's at that point the conversation tends to kind of break down into a discussion wherein people sort of revert to their own moral codes. And while that's a fine place to start, the conversation quickly and often becomes unproductive because we can't quite agree on what's creepy or what's not. It's hard to find a sort of common set of values. And that often results in constraints to innovation because we're not in agreement about what's okay and what's not. One of the other outcomes of that is often increases the risk of unintended consequences. If we're not thinking through what some of the consequences, the long-term implications of correlating particular pieces of data are, that we don't really understand what some of the risks are. So after seeing this conversation take place a number of times, I got to thinking about the fact that there really is no ethical framework for talking about creating a common vocabulary for productive discussion. And one of the results of that work and discussion with a lot of folks, some of whom are on a webcast today, we created this framework to help people come up with a way to talk about and understand the influence of our values on our actions. Part of the purpose of that is really to find a common set of values amongst working groups, internal and external teams, in alignment with your customers and your business. And the idea is to just figure out a way to take action that's in alignment with those values. Next slide. There we go. So today we want to talk about a path forward, and the way we'll do that is we're going to review some of the key concepts that are in the book. The overall purpose for this work is really just to raise awareness and engagement in the discussion. We want to create some capabilities and help organizations and individuals develop capabilities to have to execute on intentional ethical inquiry. One of the key concepts we'll talk about today is what we call big data's forcing function. And the reality is big data is large enough and pervasive enough in our lives that it really touches so many parts of our lives today that the ethical implications are just inherent in its presence. So we really think that being explicit about engaging in discussion and using some kind of framework to be able to come to agreement about what our values and what our actions should be around using big data technologies has a number of benefits. We talk about the 4 aspects of big data ethics. We'll talk about those in detail. We help you identify what we call ethical decision points. Ethical decision points are those moments wherein you realize you have a choice to make. You can either correlate that data to provide the new feature and functionality that your data architect says is so cool, or you can choose not to do that. We talk about how to align values and actions and what that means in intentional practice with big data technologies. And we propose an evolution on an old tool called a user persona, and we evolve that into a value persona. And we'll talk about what that looks like in a little more detail. There's a couple benefits that we think that this framework really is going to be able to provide. One of the big ones is an increased ability to innovate collaboratively. So if you think just for a moment about other effective organizations whose members share values, there's lots of social, religious, and political organizations, and all of them, or ones that are very successful, often have a very clear set of values, and those values are explicit. They are communicated widely and frequently to the members of that organization, and it's something that is helpful to them because it helps everyone sort of understand what actions they're taking and why. A framework can also help reduce that risk from unintended consequences that we were talking about a minute ago. But I want to make clear that a reduction is not an elimination. Unintended is very difficult to predict. That's sort of the nature of it. But explicit values can give you a place to start identifying a response in the presence of some of those unintended consequences. Most recently, if you follow technology news, there's a social media application called Path, which was started by one of the original Facebook technologists. And Path was caught up in a privacy issue recently where it was found that they were downloading people's entire address books onto their mobile devices. And that certainly was an unintended consequence on the part of Path's side. But once that became public knowledge, they had to respond to that. And understanding what they valued about the service that they were providing and some of the other aspects of big data that we'll talk about in a minute, at least would give them a place to start talking about what action they were going to take in response to it. So I'm just going to start out very quickly with a couple basic factoids. So what is this big data thing? There's a pretty wide group of people in the audience today, so if you're very familiar with big data, please bear with me for just a minute. I am going to assume a little bit of familiarity with big data, and I just want to make the point that the exact position or the line of demarcation between data and big data is not super critical for ethical inquiry. We understand, some of the characteristics of big data. It's very large, unstructured data sets and supporting technologies. The Hadoop file system, HFS, is a central component of the technology. The amount of data in big data is typically measured in exabytes or petabytes or zettabytes, which are just very, very large, exponentially sized quantities of data. One of the most unique aspects of big data technologies is that it allows for the capturing and processing, storing, and querying of very large unstructured data sources. The thing to understand about Hadoop is that it is not a single component technology. Hadoop itself is a framework. Hadoop is a framework or technology stack for distributing applications and data. And there are lots of familiar examples out in the world, and we know a bunch of them. Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter are all tools that we're generally familiar with and make significant use of big data technologies. But there are also lots of other applications, and the application is the domain space in which big data is being used is expanding rapidly. Research data sets, for example, in longitudinal studies in education, healthcare studies for new drug trials, and historical success rates for various procedures. All of that data can now quite easily be captured and utilized. Manufacturing and supply chain uses inventory and logistics, keeping track of those items. Mobile device data. There's a huge amount of information that's captured every time you turn on your mobile device. There's a phrase in the industry. It's called volume, variety, and velocity. Just as a couple examples. So if big data is about, if those are sort of the three main characteristics of big data, just a bit of information, on the volume side, Facebook stores 40 billion photographs. So 40 billion is a pretty large number. In the variety characteristic, there's an increasing number of data types which can be stored using big data technologies, including audio, video, telemetry data, so performance data for engines, vehicles, supply chain, retail transactions, health information, the vital signs that are taken every hour if you're in the hospital. All of that information can be captured using big data technologies. In the velocity category, just as an example, decoding the human genome used to take years, and now it takes about a week. So the speed and the pace at which we can now process complex and unstructured data sets is increasing rapidly. So that's a little bit about what big data is. Let's talk a little bit about what this ethics thing is. It's a little unusual. Ethics is an abstract concept, but it has real-world implications. And it has real-world implications every day in our lives. Big data is not unique in this sense. Big data itself is ethically neutral, but as with most things that come associated with action in our lives, the use of that big data is not. There are ethical implications for what we do with that information technology. And it can be hard sometimes. There's polarizing vocabulary. We use words like good and evil and right and wrong. And sometimes those things are difficult to engage. Those can be difficult conversations to engage in. But it's important to understand that many values are already implicit in our business decisions and actions. We value happy clients. We value productive working environments. We value fair compensation packages and collaboration and innovation. So there's a lot of business drivers for understanding what our values are and doing the right thing by them. There are lots of legal or policy requirements in many industries, and there are entire business functions devoted to aligning those values with the business decisions and actions that we take every day. So it's good that we already know how to ensure that our values are being honored. We do it all the time. But one of the things we need to understand is what are those actions that we're taking together, and are they informed by our communal set of values? the way to get at that topic, or the way to get at that common set of values, is through ethical inquiry. Ethical practices are an outcome of ethical inquiry. And so, for example, while a coherent and consistent privacy policy is one possible outcome of ethical inquiry, it's not the only one. Value judgments are made all the time in the course of ethical inquiries. And as I mentioned earlier, there are oftentimes lots of legal or policy requirements that impinge upon or influence what actions we take in alignment with those values. So I mentioned a minute ago this forcing function of big data. And the reality is that it's just the pure size, shape, and velocity of big data in our lives today that is really pushing business operations deeper into our lives. In fact, it's pushing them so far into our lives that it's actually changing and influencing the common meaning of words like identity, privacy, ownership, and reputation. And we want to understand that those changes in how we understand very important words about our values actually can change those values. There's a distinct difference between the way in which digital transactions take place and non-digital interactions take place. Digital business transactions inherently capture information that's related to, but it is distinct from the interaction or the transaction itself. So, for example, if you think about it, there's a reason why illegal drugs are sold in anonymous transactions on street corners. It's because there's very little record of the event. And the reality is that to the degree that there is a record, it doesn't contain very much information. So, for example, skipped a slide there. Sorry about that. We'll go back. If we take a look at the anatomy of a tweet, which was a piece that came out about a month or two ago, and just shows the ancillary associated metadata for every tweet that is published in the world. Not only does it contain the content, the information of the tweet itself, but it contains things like where it was tweeted from, the country, the application, the computer program that was used to tweet it, the screen name and the biography of the person, the number of followers and the favorites that they have. So there's a lot of ancillary information there that is associated with that digital transaction itself. So there's some ways to think about this, and I'll tell one of the stories on the slide that we skipped a second ago. So in 1987, Robert Bork was nominated to be a justice on the Supreme Court, and the Senate failed to confirm his nomination. There was a lot of drama around that. If you were around at the time, you remember that part of the turmoil, and part of the drama, part of the controversy was that somebody had gotten a hold of Robert Bork's video library rental history. And they made kind of a big deal about, some of the movies that he watched and thought that influenced or said something about his character. And they made a lot of political hay about that. So remember, this is in 1987. As a result of that event, Congress passed a law that said that your video rental history is private information and nobody can have access to that. That law has been on the books since, I believe, 1989. And interestingly enough, last year, so just 22 or 23 years later, Netflix posted a public appeal to its customers asking Congress to call their legislators and see if they could get that law repealed. And one of the reasons is because Netflix wanted people on Facebook to be able to share the videos that they had watched with their friends. So just a mere 20-some-odd years prior, that information was deemed so private that Congress passed a law that stated that you couldn't access that information. Now, big data is creating a capability for us to do that, and it turns out there are a lot of people that are interested in doing that. So big data has actually changed how we value privacy, how we think about the actual meaning of the word privacy. Then there's a couple thought starters on this slide. Imagine if Hemingway had a blog, or JFK tweeted, or Rosa Parks was on Facebook. The amount of access and exposure and awareness that we would have to other people's activities is just mind-bogglingly and tremendous. There are future implications for the use of big data technologies on our values. What will our grandchildren know about us that we didn't know about our grandparents? I hesitate to speculate on some of the things that may have happened in the 30s and 40s with my grandparents. The Library of Congress is archiving all tweets that have been made since 2006. There have been massive political changes that have taken place riding on the backs of big data technologies. The political uprising in Egypt, many of the communications that took place to coordinate those activities took place over Twitter, which uses big data technologies extensively. Recently, the Stop Online Piracy Act proposed as legislation in Congress was essentially overturned as an initiative as a result of grassroots activism on the internet that took place over lots of platforms using big data technologies. So the kinds of social change in all kinds of industries, healthcare, education, even the weather, our ability to capture historical weather data and process that in real time, and to be able to query that using big data for predictive purposes is becoming more and more of a reality. So there's a forcing function that's taking place, and that brings some risks and it brings some opportunities. Some of the risks are, I think, sort of obvious to a certain degree. There's security risks. With that much information out there, what can we be said, how can we be said to secure that information? How can we be said to honor individual privacy? How can we know for a fact that we are in compliance with the legal requirements in our industry? Customer engagement, it's a huge risk. The frequency at which customers can access information about our products and services and vice versa creates a substantial risk. It also creates a substantial opportunity to build deeper relationships with them, to innovate and evolve our products and services, provide deeper insights into what's happening in the world, both socially and at a retail level, manufacturing, wholesale, create broader outlooks. Some of those studies we mentioned a minute ago, improving our understanding of how education, various tools are effective or not effective, and so on and so forth. So how do we balance those two seemingly opposing forces, the risks that big data takes, and how do we seize the opportunities for innovation that big data provides us? And the first step in that we propose is to use the force itself. So the variety, velocity, and volume of information that big data provides, we need to acknowledge that. We need to frame that up in a way that is understandable to a common group of individuals who are working towards a single end. We need to differentiate what some of the ethical aspects of those actions are, and we need to be able to engage them in a way that everybody is comfortable with. So we propose and talk about in the book 4 aspects of big data ethics. We identify them as identity, privacy, ownership, and reputation. Excuse me, 1 second. So the thing about those 4 aspects is we want to understand that no one of them is any more important than any of the others in the abstract. In your particular circumstance, in developing a policy, in trying to make a decision about which path to take forward, understanding what your common values are and which actions you want to take in support of them, those 4 aspects stand sort of equal. They all contain, and we'll talk in detail in a second here, they all contain their own particular ethical characteristics, but the framework itself helps us to differentiate between some of the ethical implications of decision-making about the use of any kind of big data technology. So let's talk for a minute about some of the questions. So the identity question really focuses around, is our offline existence identical to our online existence? And there's a lot of debate about that, and there's a lot of discussion, and people have very strong opinions. There are some people who think that the answer is obviously yes. There are some people who think that the answer is obviously no. But we want to be explicit and engage the questions themselves, and we want to do that in a collaborative fashion, and that's sort of the central topic around identity. The central topic around privacy is, who should control access to data about you? Privacy is a very large and very important issue. O'Reilly recently published a book called Privacy and Big Data, which is very good and recommended. It's a detailed discussion of some of the aspects of privacy, what's being done and what's not being done, and how people are currently thinking about it and evolving their perspectives on personal privacy. The central topic around ownership is, what does it actually mean to own data about ourselves? There are ancillary but true facts about me. For example, I am exactly 6 feet tall. That is a piece of data about me. But in the offline world, in a non-digital transaction, I don't particularly think that I own that fact about me. And in fact, if that piece of information, is useful for you, excuse me, in another context, then you're probably free to use that fact and do what you will with it. In the online world, in a digital transaction, there are lots of ancillary facts, as we mentioned earlier, often captured in the metadata of a transaction or an interaction itself, that people make extensive use of that data. So the question is, who owns that data? Can we transfer the rights to it? And what are sort of the obligations for people who both generate and use that data? The central topic of reputation is really, how can we determine what is trustworthy? It used to be the case that your reputation consisted of what people who knew you and the people that they knew probably thought about you. Nowadays, it's entirely possible for someone on the other side of the world to take a look at my digital life and form an opinion about whether or not I'm trustworthy, or whether I'm an expert, or to make lots of other judgments about my character. So let's talk about each of these in turn briefly, and I'll just drive through kind of some of the topics and characteristics of the discussion around each of these aspects today. So Chris Poole is the founder of 4chan. He's a thought leader in the internet industry. Was recently presenting at the last, I believe, Web 2.0 conference, and came up with a very insightful and pithy phrase that identity is prismatic. And his point is that there are various facets and aspects to each of our identities as individuals that we present in different circumstances. We tell our mothers some things that we don't tell other people, and vice versa. So there are slightly different facets of us as individuals that we present in different situations. On the opposite side of that spectrum, Mark Zuckerberg, the famous founder of Facebook, was recently quoted as saying that having two identities for yourself is an example of a lack of integrity. So from that perspective, the argument is that, in fact, you only do have one identity, and that identity is the same both online and offline, and that trying to assume otherwise really demonstrates a lack of character. So you'll notice that also goes to the question about reputation. Fred Wilson, who is a very well-known and successful venture capitalist focusing primarily on internet and media companies, recently proposed what he called a lightweight online identity, which would be a centralized system of some sort that you can associate your digital trail or your digital life with. There are lots of new products and services that have launched around this. The majority of them focusing on actually helping you manage the increasing number and complexity of, if you will, facets of your online identity. The U.S. government recently proposed a national strategy for trusted identities. So the government is getting into the act and wants to have something to say and to provide a service to help people manage that complexity of online identity. Google Plus recently changed their policy on pseudonyms. The original policy was that if you wanted to have a Google Plus page, you needed to have one name, and it had to be your real name, and nicknames weren't allowed, and so on and so forth. As a result of the subsequent discussion and a little bit of controversy around that, Google actually changed their policy. So as we can see, each of these aspects, starting with identity, are all very actively under discussion and debate today, and the purpose, again, for being able to create some sort of a framework around them is really to separate out and to help us understand where one issue starts and stops and another one starts. So let's go on and talk a little bit about privacy. And maybe I should take a quick break here and ask, Yasmina, you can hear me okay? And are there any questions rising up?
Hi there, Cord. Yep, we can hear you just fine. And actually, we have several questions coming in the Q&A tab. Are you able to see those, or would you like me to read a couple to you?
Nope, I can see them. Okay, great. Let me make sure that I can... Let me take a quick look here. All right, let me, what I think I'll do is I will go through the next three aspects of the framework and talk a little bit about those, and then maybe we can address some of the questions, because I kind of see a little bit of a theme there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the discussion and topics around privacy. There's a paper that came out a few years ago by a gentleman named Paul Ohm. And Paul Ohm is a lawyer at the University of Colorado Law School. He works primarily in the intersection of law and technology. He's a very lucid and clear thinker. Definitely recommend that you look up his work. And one of the papers that he wrote contained this very nice, concise phrase. It said, data can either be useful or perfectly anonymous, but never both. And the challenge that he was pointing out there with respect to privacy is that the moment that you start to put data together with any kind of personally identifiable information, you begin to erode the privacy of that particular individual. And in fact, quite a long time ago, I think I want to say 2001, there was a study done, and one of the outcomes of that study was that they realized 87% of all Americans can be identified by just 3 data points. So if I know your gender, your birth date, and your zip code, 87% of all Americans can be identified. And what that means is that in any particular set of data, if I have 2 out of those 3, or 1 out of those 3 even, and I can correlate that information with another set of data, then I can personally identify you. There's just been a huge uprising of discussion and talk in the mainstream media. In the last 12 months, the Supreme Court ruled that warrantless GPS tracking is unconstitutional. The federal government, in the form of Homeland Security, is testing crime prediction technologies. So they're tracking individual information and actions over crimes that have taken place in particular areas in an effort to try and predict where crime will take place in the future. Mark Zuckerberg, again, declares the age of privacy to be over. There are, again, lots of new products and services that have been launched based on controlling and managing your individual privacy. I mentioned privacy and big data. Again, I would recommend that work. O'Reilly published that. It came out, I believe, last fall. Recently, Google has streamlined more than 60 privacy policies into one, which has generated some intense industry debate and actually congressional inquiry. As we all know, Google has, the largest store of information in the world, and many of us use Google services. And it used to be the case that Google did not track your activity across all of those services. They are changing that policy, and one of the possible implications of that, of course, is that Google will now know much more about you as an individual, and the fears are that significantly erodes your personal privacy. Let's talk a little bit about some of the questions and topics around ownership. With respect to your data, Google actually has an entire website, liberatingyourdata.com, devoted to understanding what information Google knows about you and how to extract that information from Google should you so choose. The government of the United Kingdom has recently proposed a personal identity data marketplace. And I just noticed very recently, there's a D.C. company based in Washington, D.C. that does the same. The idea there is that your personal data has value. As you notice, one of the data points, the World Economic Forum has kicked off a multi-year initiative around privacy and personal data. And they now describe personal data as a new economic asset class. So the idea is that we can actually trade, sell, and basically treat your personal data as a currency. Doc Searls, who is another well-known thought leader in the Internet industry, co-author of the Clue Train Manifesto, if you remember that, has recently called for an end to collecting personal data. As another sort of news item, the Sierra Club is taking Orange County in Southern California to court, claiming that because the GIS, or Graphical Information System, data that has been collected by the county government was collected using taxpayer funds, that the taxpayers actually own that data. So again, there's a lot of discussion about who actually owns the data, whether or not we can transfer ownership, sell those rights, and what sort of ancillary requirements there are for making sure that ownership is honored. Last element of the framework, reputation. We mentioned a minute ago Google Plus policy changes on pseudonyms. A couple of years ago, 2007, a gentleman named Daniel Solov published an entire book called The Future of Reputation. The key components of that work are essentially the realization that the number of conversations and interactions that we can take place and participate in this day and age fragments our ability to manage our reputation in the ways that we used to, and understanding the implications of that are going to be very, very important down the road. Again, new products and services have launched. Reputation management has become a legitimate business service. If you Google reputation management, there will be lots of companies that come up, and they are more than interested in helping you, in providing a service to help you manage your reputation online. There's 2 links there. I'm not sure. I don't think you can click on them, but you should be able to see what they are. And there's just this ongoing, very active debate about reputation. And I put 2 ends of the spectrum there. Fred Wilson, again, who I mentioned earlier, is a very frequent blogger and thoughtful and insightful thinker. And he has a post that basically represents one end of that spectrum, saying reputation is very much alive, and we need to actively manage our brand identity, our individual reputation online. There was a TechCrunch article recently that came out that said reputation is actually dead, that it has been so fragmented and so disjointed now that we literally can't control our reputation online anymore. So 2 ends of those spectrums. So let's see. Yasmina, how do you want to handle these questions?
Alrighty, Cord. We can do a couple of things. If you're at a point where you'd like to address a few of them, we can certainly do that. I'm sure the audience would like it. Or we can hold them all for Q&A, the time we have remaining for Q&A once you are at a point that your presentation is ready to wrap up.
Okay. Let's see. Why don't I push through, and then we can see about taking some of these questions. So I think some of the rest of this may address some of the topics that have been asked. Okay. So we talked about so far those 4 aspects of big data ethics: identity, privacy, ownership, and reputation. One of the things we thought we'd do in the book is go out into the world and actually take a look at what's actually going on in practice. How are companies actually dealing with those 4 aspects of big data ethics? So we just sort of took a representative sample of the Fortune 50. We did this research last summer, so whatever the Fortune 50 was at that point, we went out, we have a big spreadsheet, and we looked at all of the publicly available, public-facing data handling and privacy policies of each of the Fortune 50. And in the book, we have a whole chapter on this in the book, and there were lots of interesting findings, but I just want to talk about one here today because it gives a very good example of what we call an ethical decision point. So with respect to the buying and selling of data, so this goes to privacy, it goes to ownership, we found that on the one hand, 34 out of the Fortune 50 said explicitly that they would not sell personal data without consent. That is to say, they wouldn't sell your personal information unless you had agreed to let them sell it. And there was no policy saying that they would sell personal data without it. So on the one hand, they're willing to sell it under certain circumstances. On the other hand, 11 out of the 50 stated that they would buy data from third parties. But none of them stated that they would not buy personal data. So this is a little confusing, but if you think about it, what that means is if it's not okay to sell something, how can it be okay to buy it? So basically what we realized is that buying personal data is common practice in a lot of current business models, at least out of the Fortune 50. But but none of them are comfortable enough with the practice to state publicly that they'll also sell it. And one of the things that this comes up against is it creates what we call an ethical decision point. And it's just this question that in the moment, technologists and business people might be sitting in a room and have a discussion about whether it's acceptable in their value framework to have that position. We think that actually is a little bit ethically incoherent. And we think that that incoherence is reflected when your values and your actions are in conflict. One of the phrases you might be familiar with to help understand what this ethical decision point is this phrase, we don't know what we don't know. And the idea is that if there's an opportunity, let's say in the case of a Fortune 50 corporation, to generate revenue from selling your personal information, the immediate question is, well, if it's okay to sell it, then who's going to buy it? And the question then becomes this opportunity to align your values and your actions. And one of the things that an ethical decision point raises is more questions than answers. But the idea is to reduce your value conflicts when you're facing opportunities to innovate using big data technologies. The idea is that an ethical decision point gives you an opportunity to create a comfort factor, to reduce the creepy, so to speak. And it gives you an idea of what your communal values are and the ability to make sure that those are in alignment with your actions in lots of different real-world scenarios. So adding a new product feature, when you're developing a policy, in response to an actual or a potential security breach, designing new products and services, opportunities to use or combine data in new ways. These are all circumstances that are very familiar, especially to a lot of business people, and the implication of one of the circumstances that those create are ethical decision points. When we come upon an ethical decision point, there's this continuous cycle of action that we propose we engage in. It's very simple. It's inquiry, understanding, articulation, and action. And just very quickly, the inquiry is a very straightforward audit of current data handling practices. We want to understand what we're actually doing as opposed to what we think we're doing. We want to be able to articulate that clearly. We want to articulate that in an explicit and transparent fashion so that we can build common consensus around what that decision point is and what action we should take. But then we want to take that action in alignment with the values that we generate. We've talked a lot about alignment, and we talked a little bit earlier about the fact that values are already implicit in many of our business decisions. But we want to talk for just a minute about some of the benefits in a little more detail. We did mention briefly that, other effective organizations whose members share and have a set of common values, they gain a measured degree of effectiveness through that alignment. But there's also a reduction in that risk from unintended consequences. So the risks of misalignment create barriers to innovation, can generate a lot of conflict in working teams. We just want to talk briefly a little bit about one way that working groups and teams and organizations, a tool that they can use to talk about what those values are and how they would show up in your actions. And we talk about this tool called value personas. So value personas are an evolution of a traditional tool in mostly in marketing and advertising worlds, called the user persona. And a user persona is a methodology that attributes characteristics to a hypothetical individual, and the idea is to identify that hypothetical individual to help segment audiences and to understand what their needs are so that we can understand their behaviors in a fictional example and be able to predict what our how well our goods and services are going to meet those needs. Value personas offer an organization a way to capture a common set of values that can be used to encourage that alignment and make sure that business practices are acceptable and that individual behaviors are based on that common set of values. They include a description of key roles, so roles and responsibilities within the organization, managers, executives, line staff. We want to identify those shared values and create a vocabulary for that explicit dialogue. Typically, these are designed in collaborative workshops with a cross-functional team so that there are lots of inputs and that all sort of perspectives can be hashed out. There are many common considerations: intention, security, likelihood, aggregation, responsibility, timeline, what some of those roles in the organization are. So these are some of the ways that value persona can, these are some of the characteristics that a value persona can take on. You could describe how, for example, if you value transparency in your organization, you might build a value persona around transparency and express how transparency shows up in your daily business practices, in your policies and procedures. You might be interested in using that to communicate that out to your customers or to your market. You might be able to say expressly or intently, explicitly, at company XYZ, we value these things, and we know that you do too, and so our products and services are actually in alignment with your values. And there are lots of well-known organizations who stand very clearly on their values. Patagonia is, a well-known example. Nike, Ben & Jerry's, they take very explicit stands on their values, and they use that to their business advantage. So, and there are some common themes in these discussions. We need to understand big data is ubiquitous. It is everywhere now. It is permanent. That information is very, very hard to erase or delete. As a reminder, an example we mentioned a few minutes ago, the Library of Congress is archiving all tweets that have been made since, I think, 2006. And when the Library of Congress archives something, it stays archived. So that information is going to be there for, one would assume, generations to come. Big data is explicit. That information, data is data. The facts of the matter are in, the veracity and validity of the data itself is inherent in the information. Big data is often aggregated. So sets of information is correlated with other sets of information in ways that really raise some of those questions that we talked about around the four aspects of big data ethics: identity, privacy, ownership, and reputation. Lastly, we just want to sort of wrap things up here and talk about some of the key characteristics or key concepts in the book in a little bit of a context. And just encourage you to acknowledge the complexity at ethical decision points. As we mentioned in the beginning, ethics is a fairly abstract concept that has very real-world implications. And moving from the conceptual to the concrete can be a highly nuanced and tricky and complex activity. So engage that nuance and be explicit with those discussions. Don't let it stop at, that moment where it becomes an argument about whether it's creepy or not. Well, let's talk about what aspect of creepy are we talking about. Is it because it violates privacy? Is it because it unfairly impinges upon your reputation? Is it because you don't feel like you have the right or I have the right to do that with your data because you own it and I don't? Use value personas to help create a common understanding. The book contains a worksheet and a lot more detail about how to use value personas. And it's just a tool that you can use in the room to facilitate that dialogue and discussion in a way that is productive and healthy, and encourages alignment of your values and your actions. In closing, there's a company out there that I've worked with in the past that just does a really outstanding job of making its values explicit. The name of the company is called ExactTarget, and there are a couple links there on the slide. ExactTarget has what they call a company culture of orange. Orange is one of their company colors, and they actually call acting in accordance with their values being orange. And there's a very explicit set of criteria and descriptions about what it means to be orange. And during the onboarding process at ExactTarget, people explicitly talk about and get trained and educated on what those characteristics of being orange are. And people refer to it in the room. They ask if a particular action is orange. And what they mean is that action that you're about to take in alignment with our common, collaborative values? So they make it explicit, and it's a good organization to take a look at as an example of best practices. And then lastly, just wanted to kind of leave you with this notion of transparency and a question that you can ask yourself and others in your organization. If your data handling actions were known today, would they align with your values? And would they align with your customers' values or your organizational partner values? So just think about what transparency means and whether or not you are currently acting in alignment with your values. And with that, I will close it off and leave you with the last slide. Would like to mention that when the book is released, we will be launching a companion website called Ethics of Big Data. There we'll be providing resources and other information. We'll be publishing interviews with thought leaders in the field, giving different perspectives on some of the ethical aspects of big data, and we'll hopefully be able to promote and encourage more explicit dialogue about the topic. Feel free to contact me via email or Twitter. I love talking about this and would be happy to follow up with anybody directly in more detailed discussion. That's about it right now. And Yasmina, do you want to maybe turn to some questions? How much time do we have?
Hi there, Cord. It's remaining. So, folks, we appreciate you sticking around as we get to the Q&A part. And, Cord, we do have just a few questions in there. If you want to take maybe the first two, I think our audience would really appreciate that. Back to you.
Sure. I'm looking them up right now. Hang on one second. So, okay, I think, so one question was, an example of, I assume, big data ethics that is not about privacy. I think we've covered quite a few of those, but let me go back to one of the aspect slides here. I think probably, Yasmina, is the identity slide showing?
Yes, it is.
Great, thank you. Thank you. I think identity is probably one of the other more familiar and easy aspects of big data to sort of get your mind wrapped around. And, the reality is the debate is almost exactly as it's been characterized. And it's been going on for generations. Who are we as an individual, and how do we represent our identity and our existence? And it turns out that online, the way in which we represent our existence has evolved significantly. There's a famous New Yorker cartoon that was published in 1993 that says, "On the internet, no one knows you're a dog." And the reality is, while that seems to have a little bit to do with privacy, and it does, it also has to do with identity. It has to do with how you represent yourself online. And nowadays, because big data technologies have created this ecosystem where your digital life is now present in so many different ways, the opportunity to correlate information about you and your identity makes it relatively easy for an individual to actually figure out not only what kind of dog you are, but what your favorite treat is and whether you've ever been, won a ribbon in the dog show. So big data has a very strong influence on our identities and how those are constructed and represented online. I'm looking at other questions here. So there's a question, is there any recourse that users have when it comes to data mining or the convergence of big data sets? I think that's a great question. I think there are a lot of implications of that because as consumers, especially in the U.S., and as users or participants in environments like social networking sites like Facebook or MySpace or even professional social networks like LinkedIn, the reality is we often feel like we don't have a lot of power. There have been discussions about whether it's even possible now to delete all traces of your existence on the Internet. In direct response to that question, I think the answer is that we need to raise the ethical topic and engage in more ethical discussion. And the reason is because just being explicit about the fact that we feel like we don't have the rights or the power that we need to with respect to our individual data sets in the world is an issue that we want addressed. So do we have any direct recourse? Probably not today. Are there things that we can do to help evolve and grow our capability to manage and control our own digital lives? Yeah, absolutely, I think so. And one of those things is to make those questions about the 4 aspects of big data ethics more explicit.